Hi everybody, Tom here. I'm on Nantucket Island, Massachusetts, USA, late January, and looking at a couple of things. First of all, history of Nantucket. Unfortunately, as with so many other written histories, tends to start with mention of the 1602 glancing blow of a English sailor. Seeing it at least, and but not settling, and then 30 years later, 40 years later, it was settled by conquerors, colonists. There was certainly a native population here at the time, and they outnumbered the settlers until the early 1700s. But what's mostly interesting to me is the natural science of the place, of course, because that's what we talk about here. By the time the Revolutionary War was over, this place was not a tree in sight because the settlers had cut everything down, building houses, building boats, and of course keeping themselves warm. The population, mostly white population since that time, of course, fluctuated greatly depending on war, global trade, and of course the trade was largely about whaling. If you look into it, Nantucket is just historically huge in the whaling industry, and the central location as far as what may have been the inspiration for Moby Dick, a story called The Heart of the Sea. If you look that up, you'll learn more about it. A ship from Nantucket called the Essex was smashed by a big whale, and Melville heard about that and ended up writing that story back in our home region of the Berkshires in western Massachusetts. Back to the trees. Before the white settlers came along, there were a lot of trees here, a lot of hardwoods, a lot of oaks, beeches, and maples. How do we know that? Well, we know that by archaeologic discovery of pollen. You can find pollen deposited, and then you can test it, you can date it, and determine the DNA from what species the pollen came. So 400 years ago, this was a forest. And now it looks like a sandbar. And the big picture, we think about Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and a lot of coastal areas as just being sandbar, because those are the smaller particles that the water can move around, right? Keep beating it up, making it smaller and smaller and smaller, depositing it, taking it, putting it back, taking it, putting it back. But there was, and there still is, some clay here. So this was high ground once upon a time, and at the end of the last ice age is when it got separated from mainland. There's evidence of native humans living here on Nantucket 20, 30,000 years ago. We keep getting away from the trees. Now there's hardly any trees, and right now I'm on the southwestern edge of the island, and look at this. There's a house. We're almost to low tide right now. That's about maybe 80 feet from where I'm standing right now. The house is another 40 feet behind me. Low tide. And here's this huge drop off. There was a storm recently, and it's a little pine tree bush right there holding on, that's just about to fall off of this precipice. A bunch of this land just fell away, and apparently the house next door just to the east was completely destroyed by this storm. So one can't help but wonder what would have happened in such an event if this place had not been largely deforested, or entirely deforested, as the case may be. Now there are some trees because there's some protected areas, but over a very short span of time, over the course of less than 150 years, the place was denuded. And I just can't help but wonder how much soil was lost, how much vegetation, how much plant diversity, how much species diversity, flora and fauna was lost. Not to mention how many whales were slaughtered around the world, originating from here and other places on the East Coast and around the world. Hopefully we're getting better. Right now, we see a lot of evergreens growing here that were replanted. The plantations that were installed, mostly evergreens, probably as building materials, as plantation for building materials. Plus they're easy and they grow fast. Not too many big hardwoods. Those few that I've seen so far are more like in the villages, right, for shade and ornamental value, which is cool. But out here in this end of the island, just very few trees. And wow, I wish I could snap my fingers and put a forest back. You know, it's just not how it works. It takes a long time, and not very long to make it go away. So not the happiest of news, but just a pretty interesting and a stark picture this morning of this 7 or 8 foot drop here, over the course of maybe 2 or 3 feet, just boom, and that soil and that vegetation is washed away, and there's nothing down there but sand right now. Plant trees. Now get outside, turn this thing off.